With yours truly, Dr. Sarah Webb of Colorism Healing. I am waiting to, here we go. All right. So I'm really excited about this week. The topic is defining colorism. How we define colorism matters. And so I want to make sure that we get it right. If you don't know who I am the founder of Colorism Healing. I provide speaking, training, and consulting to businesses that are ready to advance their DEI strategies. And this is a series of live streams that are based on my corporate colorism ebook slash PDF. So I'll be going through each section of that resource week to week. This week we are on defining colorism, but if you want to read ahead of class, you can download that PDF for free. There should be a link in the description box below or in the comments or on the website at colorismhealing.com. So as you join live, be sure to say hello. Let me know where you're tuning in from. I do like interactive lives. And I will save time at the end for questions and comments, but you're free to chat me up throughout our conversation. Yeah? Let me see how my folks on Instagram are doing. Okay, good. Hey, everybody. Thank y'all for joining. So, in thinking about how we define colorism and why that matters, I want us to understand that language is continuously evolving. And being a former English professor myself, I always remind people that all words are made up words. People say, oh, that's just a word you made up. Well, that was true of every word at some point, right? Humans create language in order to describe our reality. And so we invent language, we invent the words that we use every day. And so colorism has not always existed, but as the phenomenon started to happen, people coined the language in order to describe what they saw happening. And I want to read a quote by James Baldwin in 1979, where he explains the power of language specifically for Black people in that context, but thinking about people who are trying to describe their experiences of oppression or people who are trying to describe their experiences of marginalization. So James Baldwin wrote that people evolve a language in order to describe and thus control their circumstances, or in order to not be submerged by a reality that they cannot articulate. And if they cannot articulate it, they are submerged. And so when I first started writing and speaking and teaching about colorism publicly, in 2011, I had not heard of the term colorism yet. So I had been experiencing it my entire life, but didn't know what it was called, didn't know that there was terminology for it, didn't know how to articulate what I was feeling and experiencing. And so many people that I've met over the past 12 years have said the same thing. When we start talking about colorism, they say, oh, yeah, I know what you were talking about. I didn't know that's what it was called. I didn't know that there was language for it. And they talk about how it's kind of a sigh of relief to finally have a word for this thing that they've always experienced. So, colorism was Alice Walker is credited with coining the term colorism. It does have, if you Google colorism or colorist online, I think it also refers to people who create the color scheme of a film, or sometimes refers to people who color hair, right? But obviously, we're talking about colorism as in the system of oppression of dark skinned people, right? But Alice Walker in 1983 is really the first person who started using this term or used this term to describe the phenomenon of people who identify the same racially, have different skin tones, having different experiences based on the color of their skin. And so thinking about other terms that people have used to call this phenomenon, before colorism really gained traction as the go-to terminology, people were using things like skin tone bias or skin tone prejudice, right, or skin color prejudice. People also use color struck, right? So they describe someone who is someone who perpetuates colorism. Sometimes they would call them color struck. And then other words like shadism. Shadism, I think, is a good synonym. It's not as common or as widely used, but people have used shadism. And thinking about how this term has evolved over time, I also just want to quickly note that terms like texturism or hairism and featureism are closely related to colorism, even though they are unique. So that's another example of how people have created these terms, coined these terms to describe their reality, to describe the issue that was happening in society and the culture that they needed the language to be able to articulate. And so over the years, I've started to distinguish more often between colorism and pairism and featureism. But back in the day when I first started talking about colorism, I was including all of those features, all of those regionalized features, right? There are certain physical traits that we associate with people of a certain race that we don't associate with people of other races. And so tone is one of the main ones, but also hair texture is a huge one, and facial features, eye color, and that sort of thing. And so, in terms of the definition of colorism, I define it as a social system that privileges people with lighter skin and marginalizes people with darker skin. Okay. So within that system, individuals and groups with lighter skin tones benefit from such things as, this is not an inclusive list, but some of the privileges that you might have if you have lighter skin include preferences, explicit and implicit preferences for lighter skin, compounding generational advantages, right? So if you descend from, if you have white or European ancestors or lighter skinned European ancestors, you are benefiting from that generational privilege as well. And then things like practices or cultural norms that cater to whiteness. And so thinking about, for example, the pulse oximeter that measures oxygen in the blood, where the darker your skin tone, the more pigmentation, the more melanin you have in your skin, the more inaccurate that really is, right? And so those with lighter skin tones don't run into that as a factor. And then other things like designs and structures created for whiteness. I think about technology a lot in terms of like facial recognition software and how it disproportionately fails to recognize or misinterprets, right, the faces and the features of people with darker skin tones. All right, let's see who has joined. Welcome here on LinkedIn and YouTube as well as Instagram. I can't see your comments on Instagram, but let's see. All right. Hey, welcome. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about why vocabulary matters. And keep in mind that I am taking questions and comments. So when I get to that section, if you have feedback or questions about defining colors and how to define it, please drop that in the chat. And if you're just tuning in, I am Dr. Sarah Webb of Colorism Healing, and I am on the part of the corporate colorism theme for the year where we're defining colorism and explaining why that vocabulary matters. And so I want to talk about defining colorism as being super important and why it relates to so-called reverse colorism. Okay. So there was a viral clip not too long ago of a celebrity claiming that she experienced reverse colorism. And so people were reaching out to me to do interviews, getting my opinion and my perspective on reverse colorism. And I've done an entire live stream specifically on reverse colorism, so I can try to remember to link to that in the comments if you want to dig deeper on that specifically. What I've been saying to people who've reached out to me regarding that news story or that topic is that how we define colorism is going to determine whether or not we conceive of something like reverse colorism, right? And so a lot of people who believe that reverse colorism is a thing or that that is a real system in place, they define colorism as a form of bullying, right? And so their definition of colorism might be something like disliking someone because of their skin tone, right? Or they might think of colorism or define colorism as being mean to someone because of their skin tone or based on their skin tone, right? And so if you understand colorism as a social system with systemic and structural and institutional advantages for people with a certain skin tone and systemic, historical, generational disadvantages and oppression for people with dark skin tones, then you really can't even conceive of such a thing as reverse colorism, right? Or saying that colorism goes both ways. And so I use the Robin Hood analogy a lot. I talk about how we don't consider Robin Hood stealing from the rich to give to the poor as reverse classism. A lot of times we conceive of that phenomenon as backlash to classism or a response to classism, or someone trying to navigate the system in which rich people have all of the resources and all of the capital, and poor people have been left without, right? And so you might think it's wrong to steal from rich people, right? You might think it's wrong to mistreat someone. You might think it's wrong to be mean to someone because they're rich, but that doesn't constitute a reversal of the entire social system, right? So even if you steal a rich person's car or steal their wallet, they still retain all of their privileges and advantages of being rich, right? And so just like we don't have reverse classism, and we don't have reverse racism, because these are systems, historical systems, systemic structural systems, we also don't have reverse colorism. And so that's one of the main reasons why I want people to really hone in on defining colorism as a social system and not just personal feelings or personal preferences, right? Those aspects are related to colorism. They're a facet of colorism. They have something to do with colorism, but those individual instances are not themselves representative of colorism as a social system. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of defining colorism and why I use terms like lighter and darker, I think it helps us to have more nuance in terms of identifying instances of colorism and understanding colorism cross-culturally and globally. So I received an email once where the person was asking my opinion again on using terms using the term light versus dark and using the term lighter versus darker, right? So just wanting to know why there's a distinction or if the distinction matters. And so I think it's useful in thinking about the entire spectrum of the human skin tones that people, our perceptions of skin tone can be contextual, right? And so in one place or one context or one family or one community, one neighborhood, one country, right? One location, the understanding of what is dark-skinned or what is darker skinned might vary, and so it's helpful in order to have a global analysis of colorism to also understand that it's not a binary, right? This light skin versus dark skin dichotomy that we often set up is not as binary as we might assume it is, or we often talk about it being. And so an example of that is I use a lot of analogies, if you don't already know. I use the analogy of standing in a line, right? So if you're standing in a line waiting to get donuts, I use donuts in my analogies a lot because I like donuts. So if we're standing in a line, we have a line of 25 people in line to get donuts, and you're 10th in line, you're number 10 in line, right? What happens a lot of times is people say, "Well, I'm not number 1, I'm not very first in line, and so I don't have any privilege at all," right? Or I'm not in the top 5, I'm not the first 5 people in line, and so it doesn't matter, if I'm number 10, I might as well be number 20, I might as well be number 25. But I say that even if you're not the very first person in line, you're still ahead of several other people, and that positioning matters, right? And so even if you don't see yourself as quote unquote light skinned, if you are lighter than other people in the room, if you are lighter than other people in your family, if you are lighter than other people in your community or your school, you're still going to have privileges relative to those people, right? So you don't have to be the lightest person in the world to still have some form of light skin privilege. All right. Let's see if we have any questions before I do a recap. We're doing really good on time. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Hey. Okay, let's see. Social comments. I've been waiting a week for this. Jupiter F. Stone. Oh, that's so exciting. Yay. Hello, everyone. I appreciate you. I appreciate you as well, Jenny. Tiffany Hayes says hello from Maryland. Um, we have love James Baldwin, brilliant insights. Okay, yeah, our brother James is a real one. Hello, Teresa from NYC here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Hey, Teresa. Um, Mr. Data and AI is here. Hey, Michael. Yay. The brown paper bag test. What's the origin of that? Okay, great question, Tiffany Hayes. So the brown paper bag test was used as an arbitrary marker in order to discriminate against people with darker skin tones. And it was there are similar tests, like there's the pencil test, the cone test, right? And so it was a way to exclude people with more Afrocentric or what we consider Black features, right? So coilier, more Afro-textured hair, darker skin tones, and yeah, the pencil test was also a hair texture test. And so people who wanted to hoard or reserve access to institutions, to social clubs, social organizations for people with lighter skin and or mixed race ancestry or just more Eurocentric phenotypes. They implemented things like the paper bag test, the cone test, the pencil test, the blue vein test in order to be exclusive, right? It was a way of being exclusive. And also when I talk about colorism and things like reverse colorism, I want people to know that a lot of light-skinned people in the realm of colorism are not just innocent bystanders. So a lot of times we talk about how a lot of this is a result of European colonization, the legacy of slavery, and how these systems were created by white colonialists. But a lot of our siblings of African descent, of other indigenous ancestry, were active participants in this system as well. And they were not just innocent bystanders. They were not just, passive onlookers, right? They actively participated in this type of exclusion and discrimination in order to gain higher positioning in society, right? And so the paper bag test is an example of that. Michael says, "Yeah, I know what clip you're talking about." Please continue your work. There's so much outrage instead of deep dives. Yeah, I'm all about the deep dives, MW. Wow, that is a great example. I'm glad. Okay. Yes, light skin privilege exists. This is from Jamila Simmons. Um, hey, folks on Instagram. Eliza writes word, says, love the Robin Hood example. Glad to see you and thanks for sharing your wisdom. You are more than welcome. All right. So, not a lot of questions today, which is totally fine. That means I can let you all get back to your lunch break sooner than later. But I do want to recap in case people who are joining late what we've been talking about. So one, we must talk about colorism as a societal system of privilege and oppression, with deep historical roots and far-reaching socioeconomic impact. And any definition or discussion that does not include that lens is actually making it harder to solve the problem. If we want to solve colorism, we have to stop just thinking it's bullying me versus you. You are, just mean to me because of my skin tone, right? It's so much more profound than that. It has so much more intentional historical um, momentum behind it. And we're not actually going to solve the problem if we aren't willing to acknowledge it as a system of historical oppression and also historical privileging. So your homework, because y'all know I like homework. And Natasha from the UK. Uh, Jupiter says, I'm here to learn more about color, how I can optimize the skin I'm in to push for justice for all. Awesome. I'm glad about that. So I always do homework and affirmations at the end of these. So the homework based on this is try to recognize one new type of colorism or one new example of colorism, right? And so don't worry if everyone else has quote unquote already heard of it. Your only focus is increasing your own awareness. And so with a more nuanced understanding of colorism, right? And realizing again that even if you are not considered light skinned by many people's standards, have you benefited from colorism in the sense that you were the lightest person in your family, right? Or maybe you weren't dark skinned by societal standards, but you were the darkest skinned person in your family, and you saw how your lighter skinned families, mistreated you for not being light enough, right? And so thinking about one new example of colorism that maybe you hadn't thought of before. And so I'll give another quick example. I was doing a workshop with an old college friend of mine, and they were saying, I said something about getting in a fight and the adults don't believe you, or the adults automatically take the side of the lighter skinned cousin or the lighter skinned sibling, right? And how a lot of times the lighter skinned cousin or the lighter skinned sibling know that they are going to be believed above you as the darker skinned cousin, right? So they were saying how, that happened to me and I never registered it as an instance of colorism, right? And so they said their light-skinned cousin hit them or, did something to them and then ran to the adults after hitting them. And so in their mind, they were just thinking like, "Oh, well, I have to defend myself. The adults aren't gonna believe me. They're not gonna listen to me." So understanding that on the side of the adults is colorism because they were automatically assuming the innocence or the validity of the lighter skinned cousin, but also it was colorism on the part of the light skinned cousin who hit them, right, or who taunted them because they did it knowing they would get away with it, right? That cousin knew he would get away with hitting you because he's light skinned and you're dark skinned, right? And so for the person in that workshop, that was a new perspective on the experience they had. So for your homework, I want you to kind of reflect back on things that have happened to you or things that you're seeing around you and start to identify more instances of colorism that maybe you hadn't recognized before. And then your affirmation is I understand the value of precision and nuance as useful tools to help me identify, assess, and address complex problems. Yeah. So I'll be back next week and we're going to do a deep dive into privilege, specifically within the context of colorism. So I kind of gave you a preview by talking about the analogy of standing in a line and realizing that you don't have to be the most privileged person to still have privilege. And I think that's one of the hurdles when we talk about colorism, because a lot of our light skinned um, people, our light skinned siblings say, well, I experienced racism, so I can't be privileged. And yes, you absolutely can still have privilege even if you experience racism. But again, we're going to talk about intersectionality and all of that and thinking about how we're all positioned, right? Because even people, have looked at me and said, "Well, you're not as dark as other people," right? And so, I acknowledge that. I'm willing to say I am definitely a dark-skinned woman, but there are women with even deeper, darker complexions than mine who might have experienced even more or greater degree of colorism than I did, right? And that doesn't take away from my experience to be able to acknowledge that and say that. All right. Let's see. Oh, more comments. Hey, Miss, I said hey to Natasha. Says, how can lighter skinned slash mixed people use the skin they were in to help, not hurt? So that's a great question. How can lighter skinned slash mixed people use the skin that they were in to help slash not hurt? So one thing I'll say too, and maybe this can be a different line, is I often try not to conflate light-skinned with being mixed race because there are biracial people who are my skin tone, right? So not everyone who is mixed race is necessarily light-skinned. There are people who are light-skinned and not mixed race. There are people who are dark-skinned and mixed race. And so I think that is important language too. I'm talking about language and how we use language. I think it's counterproductive to automatically assume that everyone who's mixed is light skinned and that or that those things are synonymous. And I think for that reason, a lot of times we have people who are mixed race, regardless of their skin tone, regardless if they are brown skin, light skin, or dark skin, people who are mixed race um, sort of can sometimes co-opt the conversation of colorism by saying, "Well, I never quite fit into one group. I never quite fit into another group," right? So I think that there has to be, I guess what I'm saying is I'll have to go ahead and have this conversation finally, and maybe I'll bring on some other people that I talk to in this space um, about how that isn't colorism, right? Like not being able to fit into one category or the other, right? That is more so um, based on other factors besides skin tone. That later as well. More to your question, right? How can you leverage your privilege? Whatever the source of that privilege is, but specifically thinking about people with lighter skin tones and or people who are mixed race, regardless of their skin tone, being able to use their privilege. So one of the first things you can do is acknowledge your privilege publicly. Publicly acknowledge your privilege, right? And when you walk into a space, be aware of who else is not in that space. I was on another panel and someone with a lighter skinned person was saying how when they go into rooms at their job, they say, well, yeah, there are a lot of black people here, but all of those black people are really light skinned, right? And so say something about if you're in a room where the only people of color, the only brown people or black people or African Americans or Asian people are all light skinned, then you as a light skinned person in that room have to say that. You have to point that out, right? And so I think that's one initial step that you can do is start calling out the color when you see it, especially if there aren't any other dark skinned people present, right? But then the second thing you can do, because a lot of people talk about this as well, is when you do have an opportunity to talk about colorism, right? So if you're in a space and you say, hey, everyone in this space is very light skinned and that's not okay. And they say, well, yeah, we should have a conversation about colorism. Make sure that you bring in a dark skinned person to have that conversation about colorism, right? And so not relying on the perspectives of people set the tone or set the narrative of what colorism means in society globally, right? So two things, call out the colorism when you see it, acknowledge your privilege, and when it's time to have the conversation on colorism, make sure you're bringing in and paying dark-skinned people to have that conversation. So three things that I would suggest. There's more, right? It all depends on your particular zone of influence. So I would say something different to a light-skinned teacher versus a light-skinned nurse, right? We can go into more detail with that, going forward. But I think for anyone who's lighter skinned, three things: publicly acknowledge that light skin privilege is real, call out colorism when you see it, especially if you're having an opportunity to get picked for a fellowship and everyone in that fellowship is light skinned, right? Like start calling people on that stuff. Bring it to the attention of the hiring committee, bring it to the attention of the executive board that they have a pattern of hiring or choosing light skinned people of color. And then again, that third piece is when it's finally time to have that conversation or to do that work, make sure it's being led, facilitated from the perspective of dark skinned people. Great question, Jupiter. I love your name too. I love Jupiter as a planet. I saw a couple of comments. Saint Comex says, "Can you do a reaction video to the colorism panel on Vice? Really want to see that." I haven't seen the colorism panel on Vice, but I will look at it first, and then I'll decide if want to respond. I will say to Saint Come that so many things happen in popular media and popular culture, and so really early in my career, I decided that I wasn't going to be reactive to everything that people say. One, because I don't want to have a reactive career. I don't want my platform to be a reactive platform. So I will definitely look at it and kind of see what you might be referring to and decide if it's something that I want to respond to. But I'm very choosy about the things that I talk about that I respond to. Um, and then you say, that's why I cringe when people say we're insecure. Yeah, I don't know what's effed up anymore. I don't trust my own judgment because mental gymnastics, LOL. Yeah, same comment. A lot of times I have to say to my fellow dark skinned people is let's not gaslight ourselves. Right. So I'll say that to you now and to any other dark skinned person listening. We don't have to gaslight ourselves. The rest of the society is more than willing to do that for us. So learn to trust what you're feeling, right? It's a process. You can get better at it over time, but learn to say, no, you're feeling this for a reason. There was something that made me angry on over the weekend. I was like, no, I'm not going to gaslight myself, right? Like there was something going on. Like there was a reason I felt angry about that. Yeah, so I think part of the effects or the damage of colorism is planting that seed of doubt within us, within ourselves. Like, "Well, maybe I'm being too sensitive, maybe they didn't mean anything by it," right? And even if they didn't mean anything by it, that doesn't mean it still wasn't wrong, that it still wasn't colorism, right? So I totally feel you on that. Step out of the picture sometimes, let your single dark-skinned friends go out with you sometimes. Okay, so Saint Comet is offering up their suggestions as well for what they would like to see light-skinned people do. So I'll repeat that. Step out of the picture sometimes, literally. Like if you're doing an ad or like you're shooting a magazine cover, like let it be all dark-skinned people on the magazine cover. Like you don't always have to be present. Certainly, you don't always have to be centered. Let your single dark-skinned friends go out with you sometimes. And then Amber Lynn says, right, you can be mixed with different types of African. You wouldn't necessarily be any lighter. That's the thing about us. You can get all the other color skins from any color appearance. Lucy Love says, sometimes we're in the same space with the same position, but we're treated less than and paid less than. Absolutely. Yes. All right. So those are final questions on Instagram. Um, Amazing watching from England. Thank you for watching, Alicia or Alicia. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Says, "Oh my gosh, I'm late." It's totally fine. It'll be saved on the recording. I will be a part of the replay gang. Yes, the replay gang all day, every day. I so appreciate you all's time and attention to this conversation, because it's not about spending your time with me. It's the fact that you're spending your time having a conversation about colorism. And not enough people are doing that. And so, as someone who really wants to see change and progress and see people get healing and see people held accountable to this issue of colorism, I know that the fact that you all are willing to pay attention to something that other people won't even acknowledge is a lot. So, you are taking the first step, just being here. You're taking the first step, educating yourself. You're taking the first step, you know, doing your own inner work, right? And assessing your own history, your own biases, your own experiences with colorism, right? That's where it starts. And so I am so appreciative of you for doing this work along with me. And I'll see y'all next week for another